January 28th, 1828. Levi Boone Helm came into the world in Lincoln County, Kentucky, a hard winter morning wrapped in frost and silence. He was one more child in a house that prized work over words. His father, Joseph, kept the family straight by the clock of chores and crop cycles. His mother, Nancy, ruled the kitchen and the scripture with equal certainty. They had no surplus of money. They had land, and the land demanded hands. The Helm place sat where fields met timber. Spring meant breaking ground and laying seed. Summer meant the dull ache in shoulders that never quite went away. Fall meant the rose coming down, fast as daylight allowed. Winter meant mending what the other seasons had worn out. By 6, Boone hauled water and feed. By 8, he knew the heft of tools. By 10, he was strong and liked being seen as strong. In that house, quiet counted as virtue. Boone could be quiet when quiet suited him, and impossible when it did not. Kentucky was no soft cradle in those years. It balanced between regions and tempers, north and south, east and west. And in the outlying places, the law tended to be a neighbor's opinion backed by a rifle. The Bible might lay down rules, but the knife settled arguments when the talk ran out. That arrangement suited Boone's temperament. Violence wasn't a shock to him. It was a solution. His early habits marked him as a bad bet. He goaded his brothers, baited hired men, and tested the limits of his father's patience with a grin. He was the boy who would carry a grudge farther than sense allowed. Adults called him difficult. Children learned a boundary where Boone was concerned and kept to the far side of it. If a dog yelped or a chicken limped, neighbors noticed and looked away. Private business stayed private until it staggered into public view. By 12, the cruelty had a reputation. He broke animals by beating them. He picked fights with boys who had 2 years on him just to see if he could make them back down. Once he swung a shovel into a farmhand's face over a borrowed tool. His father answered with straps and heavier labor, which only polished Boone's meanness into something harder. Punishment did not reform him. It tempered him. Sometime in the early 1830s, the Helms pulled up stakes for Missouri. Fresh ground, more of it, and the promise that the westward edge always seemed to hang just out of reach. Jackson Township, Monroe County, is where they settled. On that road out, Boone learned what a wagon train looks like when it runs short of luck. Sickness that couldn't be argued with, rivers that didn't care if they took someone, the thin line between getting through and not getting through. If a child was lost, Boone could laugh. That unnerved people who heard him. Missouri put the Helms back behind a plow, but it loosened Boone's tether. He drifted from the rows in the barn to the company of older men who drank and bragged and taught a boy how a pistol feels in the hand. He copied their swagger and the cruel jokes that came with it. He made a game of showing off, riding hard, throwing a knife into the ground and snatching it up on the run. He liked the attention as much as the danger. 17 found him in a public scrape that ended with another man on the ground, skull ringing from the butt of Boone's pistol. The talk in town said the other fellow hadn't even addressed him. The sheriff made a show of arrest, and then the family made the problem smaller with money and apologies. Boone took the lesson. Consequences were flexible if you had the nerve to bend them. He married soon after. Lucinda Frances Browning, a local girl out of Monroe County, January of '51 by the record. And if marriage was supposed to force him into shape, it did not. Drink, disorder, and rage moved into the house with him. He put a horse under his own roof for the spectacle. He beat his wife when he felt crossed. She petitioned for divorce on cruelty. In a place and time that did not reward a woman for that choice, the petition was granted. His father paid the cost and the shame. Boone carried the grievance like a stone in his pocket and spit her name as if it burned his mouth. Freed of any pretense of domesticity, he made himself a problem you could hear coming. He wore weapons like jewelry, hunted fights in doorways and yards, and dared deputies to make something of it. Men avoided his eyes. Women crossed the street. Boone mistook fear for respect and told himself it meant he was winning. By his mid-20s, the family had hardened against him. Brothers turned him out rather than argue. Joseph stopped speaking Boone's name in polite company. If Boone felt that exile, he wore it like a medal. He announced plans big enough to drown out the emptiness, California and its gold, or Texas and its open spaces, places where a man could move and never stop. He predicted duels and bodies and a reputation that would reach further than he could ride in a day. The spring of 1852 gave him a pretext to leave and a companion, his cousin Littleberry Shute, a quiet man who had the bad luck to be obliging. They laid a plan for the road west, or Boone laid it and Littleberry nodded, and Boone had other reasons to hurry. There were fresh warrants behind him after a saloon stabbing that had not yet cured itself. The two of them slipped away while most of the town slept. The days that followed showed the version of Boone that frightened even his kin. He drank from first light, rode without sense, and accused Littleberry of turning traitor over imagined slights. The ending is recorded, if not in a way that satisfies the curious. Boone killed his cousin, stabbed him through the chest, most accounts say, and fled alone. Pursuit followed. Caught, he did not meet a gallows. Instead, on the advice of physicians and for the safety of those obliged to hold him, he was consigned to an asylum. Which one depends on the teller. Missouri had opened a state lunatic hospital by '51, California had its own by the same year, and Oregon's wouldn't come until a decade later. But the pattern of his escape is common to all versions. Boone learned the routine, cultivated calm, won the privilege of supervised walks, and then simply did not come back. Once free, he began the western drift that turned his name into a problem for other men. He showed up where labor was rough and law thin. Logging outfits, mining camps, roadhouses on the line between one jurisdiction and another. He traveled light and kept his temper close. When he took from a stranger, he did not apologize. When he struck without reason, he did not explain. The stories that stuck to him moved faster than he did. Some were true, and the ones that weren't carried just enough truth to fool the ear. He learned how to vanish between Oregon trails and Idaho diggings, and as the decade turned, he pressed north to the British Columbia fields when rumors said the caribou could be worked with a pan and a mean streak. In Florence country, he shot an unarmed man in a saloon, a fighter called Dutch Fred, and left town before the dust settled. If a posse gathered, the witnesses lost heart, or lost their way, or got bought. Boone had help when he needed it, and when he didn't, he had endurance. The cannibal talk began to trail him in these years. Some men starve and die. Boone starved and lived. He told campfire stories about what a man will do when the snow climbs to his hips and the horses are gone, and he told them with a relish that made his listeners stop chewing. Whether he killed for meat or only ate the dead when the mountains tightened their grip is the part no one could prove. Boone didn't bother to deny it. He liked the way the word cannibal made a room quieter. By the late 1850s, he was a shape at the edge of things. Not a resident, not a hired hand, not a citizen whose name could be said without caution. He carried no fixed address and no remorse. He went where the next fight or the next purse might be. Towns kept their speech respectful while he was present and breathed easier when his back disappeared into the timber. Sheriffs weighed the cost of a manhunt and declared the peace better served by patience. If Boone Helm had begun in a house where order and labor were expected to cure a boy of his worst ideas, he ended this season of his life as something other than cured. He was a predator without a pack, a believer in the kind of justice a single man can make with his hands. The ledger of what he still owed was long. He intended to pay it in the only currency he respected. Spring of 1852, Pacific frontier. Boone Helm did not talk when he slipped his cage. He walked off into timber with no gear worth naming and less regret. His freedom wasn't earned by cunning. It was handed to him by tedium, thin staffing, and the easy certainty among attendants that a man like him would perish if the woods had a say. They misjudged him. The first days had no direction. He trailed water and tree line until the noise of orderly life dropped out. He drank from banks that sank under his boots, rummaged abandoned camps, and lay under branches that rattled with wind. Company wasn't required. Silence served him better. It quieted the scrape inside his head. Near the third week, he shouldered open a trapper's lean-to and found meat hard as wood, a sack of meal, and 2 knives with the right kind of edge. He ate until the ache eased, packed what would carry, and moved on. He told himself it was survival, which is one way to name theft. He favored names that made his choices tidy. By summer, he was sliding along the outer edge of the northern mines, Salmon River country, and the camps that rose quick and went to rot quicker. Law there came second to gain. Canvas beat timber. Fever outran paid dirt. Arguments ended at muzzle range. He fit like a bad foot in a broken boot. He called himself Hank. Nobody cared enough to test it. He drank with the rest, cursed with them, threw a card now and then, and slept with his boots within reach. 4 men joined up for salmon diggings on the promise of a map and a rumor. They left in August, reading the land with more faith than sense. Boone kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. By mid-September, a rockfall took one of them. The burial was short. Before dawn, Boone visited the fresh dirt and came back with the dead man's belt and boots. He wore both at breakfast. Nobody asked. There are questions men don't want to hear answers to. October thinned their food. Game was scarce and luck scarcer. One of the 3 said home looked better than this. In the kind of argument that waits for hunger to sharpen it, a blade went in and did its work. What happened to the 3rd is no better pinned down. He ran, or he slipped, or Boone coached fate along. The mountain kept the secret. Boone kept the supplies and left before first light. Weeks ground past. He crossed passes that looked the same whether a man advanced or circled. Meat was what he could catch or find already stiff with cold. Birds, ground things, once a mule that winter had seized. When the belly burned empty, he leaned on frontier logic told around fires. A man does what a man must. From the corpse of a companion gone before, he sliced meat, roasted it plain, and chewed until his jaw ached. He saved bone as if it mattered. He stepped into Eureka ahead of true winter, thinner but upright. The story he offered was the sort any camp hears. Attacked on the trail, forced to eat leather and chew bark, lucky to be alive. Nobody argued. Everybody has a version of famine. He hauled kegs in a saloon 2 weeks, split 2 fights, then left wearing a better coat than the one he'd arrived in and carrying a revolver that hadn't been his. Come March of 1853, he paid in coin and silence to ride north with a small train. The wagon boss marked that Boone carried no goods, only weapons. Somewhere along a timbered stretch, a child vanished. Boone said he'd seen nothing. The mother's cries trailed the party like a weather front. They moved on because that is what travelers do. The next seasons blurred. He kept to the line between Oregon settlements and the rougher edges that would be called Washington Territory before long. He never weighted himself with ties. He shared fires with strangers until trust warmed, then practiced a different arithmetic. Food and cash vanish easier when the man who owns them is asleep or dead. Boone liked to say at fireside that the world was weak and weak men cluttered it. One listener took offense or fear or neither. Whichever it was, he didn't make the next post. Boone did. Alone. River towns taught him that boasts, if served half true, carry further than witnesses. He drank too much on purpose and let Cannibal talk unspool in pieces, changing details like a man adjusts his hat to the wind. Sometimes he claimed hunger forced his hand. Sometimes he said revenge tasted better warm. Once he smiled and left the motive out and let the room fill it in. Lawmen in these distances did not chase phantoms past their jurisdiction. Men disappeared often enough that the ledger could not keep up. Boone understood the gap and lived in it, close to borders, far from sheriffs with staying power. He learned which ferries asked names and which did not. He learned that a road taken fast at dusk erases a day's trouble. He ran with partners now and again. There was a Burke for a while, Utah way. The two of them took down a small ranch, and the fire afterward wrote the worst of it in smoke. Boone said Burke started the killing. Burke said the opposite. A bottle made the argument academic. Burke wound up face down in dust with a hole between his shoulders. Boone rode off on his horse and didn't waste a backward glance. He edged west and back again, up into timber and down to diggings, keeping himself light, saying little, striking first if striking looked likely. A road job went hot near a lonely crossing. Shots traded. One man fell and didn't rise. Boone left a torn satchel and a woman's scarf under brush when he ran. That was enough for a small-town sheet to print a line about a dangerous drifter and leave the rest to rumor. He preferred it that way. A printed shadow works as well as a real one. He did not keep work. Work meant a boss, and a boss meant reckoning. He did not keep women either. Noise, he told a barkeeper who thought to ask. That was the longest sentence he offered on the subject. One, winter crossing, later in the decade when the Cascades closed like a fist. He set out with 6, plenty of flour and salt meat and the sort of optimism that keeps a man from checking the sky. A storm pinned them. Rations fell to counting. One man died sudden and the survivors put him down in snow and moved on stiffer than before. Cold has a way of settling arguments. Men dropped out or slipped or were helped to an end no one would sign his name to. 3 weeks after the storm began, Boone walked into an outpost alone, shaved clean, coat new, breathing easy. They couldn't keep up, he said. And that was the sum of his report. No one went looking. By 56, the name Boone Helm worked ahead of him. It traveled faster than his horse and did him favors in rooms where favors mattered. Tales sprouted along his trail like brush after a burn. That he had eaten kin. That he had used hide no tannery would honor. That he had a taste for a particular sin most men do not name. He never confirmed. He never denied. He smiled and asked, "What do you think I've done?" and let silence do the counting. He was not simple-minded. He planned well enough to live. He lied when a lie carried better than the truth and told the truth when the truth frightened men more. He could be calm for an hour if calm paid and rage for 30 seconds when 30 seconds would ruin a challenger. Conscience and loyalty never took hold. He believed in the rule a single man can make with his hands. Whatever confinement had taught him, it wasn't humility. It showed him that doors have hinges and hinges have moments. It taught him that pity is a tool if you shape your face correctly. He learned to nod at the right places and to fold his violence away like a knife when eyes were on him. Unwatched, he lived as he pleased. As the decade closed, he had crossed more country than a census could mark and left behind more stories than a court could sort. Some ended in graves men could point to. Others ended in names that never reached a ledger. He wasn't a ghost. Too many people had seen him under a hard noon sun. But the pace he kept and the fear he stirred kept consequence behind him. He didn't yet wear the name the papers would later use. That would arrive after other towns, other winters, and the final accounting. For now he was a shadow that carried a knife, a rider with no cause beyond appetite, a man long since loosed from any law except the one he could enforce. Late autumn to early winter, 1858. The Dalles to the Snake Country. The weather turned mean before they were clear of the last roofs and the last honest bread. 5 men already had a plan and a poor map. Boone Helm was not one of them. He stepped into their firelight 2 days before departure with a knife at his belt, a pistol rubbed dull, and a manner that said he'd go with them whether they liked it or not. Said he was bound east toward the army post, said he could read this land. He had no pack animal and nothing you could call provisions. They let him fall in because sometimes a man doesn't bother to make a better decision, and sometimes the worst kind of trouble looks like an extra pair of hands. They crossed the Columbia benchlands and rolled into the hills where water runs colder and farther apart. The Grande Ronde fell behind them like a memory. They carried flour and salt pork and a sack of beans that felt too light the moment it was tied shut. Someone had a decent musket. 2 carried revolvers, powder and caps sheathed in leather. No one in the lot had pushed a high pass in winter. The map had been sketched by a man who wrote down everything except where the dangers started. Snow found them early. The first skiff lay thin as ash, then doubled, then drifted. Creeks skinned over. Boots grew stiff with cold. They kept moving because stopping gets a man killed quicker than walking does. Helm stayed quiet, either thoughtful or empty, and honed his steel in short, patient strokes until the edge winked in firelight. He said little and watched much, the kind of watching that gives away nothing of what it decides. The Raft River country was gray and empty as a field of bones. There a small war party harried them for miles, a shot from the scrub, a shout in the distance, hoof marks that appeared and vanished. Nobody was killed, but luck wears thin even when it holds. By the time they reached the willow-choked bottoms of the upper Snake, tempers were shorter than the rations. They chose a line that would angle them past Soda Spring, the earth steaming in patches like a beast that refused to sleep. Then on toward Thomas's Fork, then Fort Hall, then south and east for Camp Floyd if the weather and their lives allowed. It did not take long for the arithmetic to turn on them. Flour went by the dipper, then by the pinch. Pork went by the slice until the slices were the thickness of a lie. They cut rawhide into thongs and tried not to think about eating it. When one horse went bad, they killed it and boiled bone until the broth went cloudy with the last of the fat. Helm saved the bones and boiled them again at dawn, sipping the slick from the surface as if it were medicine. He did these things without spectacle, steady as a man mending a fence. Hunger makes arguments you can't out-talk. One of the 5 wanted to turn back. Helm said the road behind was longer than the road ahead and emptier of food. He spoke soft, but the math carried. They went on. The man who wanted to turn fell behind the next day and didn't come up. Men looked over their shoulders until the cold convinced them to face forward. Another went through ice and came out shaking so hard his teeth sounded like a carpenter's rasp. He lived until morning. Then he did not. They tried to save wood by sleeping close, a knot of steam in a drifted world. Helm took the watch that no one else wanted, the one where the fire is a sullen red and the darkness seems to lean in. He worked his knife in those hours, an old habit with a new purpose. The stockade at Fort Hall had been quiet for seasons. When they finally saw its outlines in the milky light, relief rose up in them like heat. It died the moment the gate swung and gave them wind and emptiness. No garrison, no rations, broken crates, cold ash in a stove that smelled of mice. Helm walked the perimeter, counting doors and windows as if measuring angles came before disappointment. They bedded there a single night and left with nothing but new cold in their bones. They followed the river down, and when the wind lifted the snow in veils, they saw the line of their own misery trailing behind. The party thinned itself the way hard trips do, without ceremony. One man sat on a rock and said he'd rest a minute. He did not stand again. Another slowed until the others could not see him. A man can vanish that way. You call his name twice, then once more because it feels wrong not to, and then you close your mouth and walk. At last there were 3, and after another day stamped flat by weather, only 2. Boone, Helm, and a man named Burton, who had more grit than most and less fortune than anyone needs. They found an old cantonment house near the river bottoms, a structure of planks and nails and stubbornness. The roof held, the stove leaked, Burton's legs were done. Helm went on alone toward the post to scout, a thin figure moving through a world reduced to white and wind. He returned at dusk with nothing good to report. No soldiers, no stores, only doors that banged in the gusts. At some point in that failing light, a pistol answered a question no one had asked out loud. Helm ran toward the sound and found Burton near the door, the argument of the body over. Helm read the scene quickly and without sentiment. He cut at the thigh, wrapped what he took in a strip of cloth, and set aside the rest the way a careful man sets aside any store he plans to draw on come morning. He fed the stove and slept like a soldier sleeps, with his boots within reach and his knife even closer. The next day he ate, unhurried, as if neatness could borrow him a margin against judgment. He folded what remained, lashed the bundle with twine, and stepped out. He walked until the white began to loosen its hold, and then kept walking because the only choice left was to continue. He crossed stretches where the snow turned to crust that bore him up, then to slush that soaked his boots, then back again to brittle skin. He watched the river's course like a map a man can't lose. He did not sing or talk or pray. He conserved his breath the way he conserved everything else. Near a camp of people who had fires to spare and no interest in strangers' tales, he accepted warmth as if it were his due. A trader came by and weighed him with a practiced eye, a man built of trails and transactions. He took Helm along toward settled ground. Helm carried his wrapped meat in a silence that cut conversation down to the necessary. The trader noted that Helm did not shake the way starved men shake, and that his eyes were clear. If he had questions beyond that, he did not ask them where others could hear. When Helm reached civilized rooms, he had a story ready, and it came out even, without stumbles or extra flourishes. Weather had closed on them. They had eaten their horses, then their leather. He had chewed bark. He had walked because to stop would have been to freeze in place. The men who did not make it had died of common causes: cold, hunger, error, nothing worth stamping into the record. He did not mention a house by the river, or how a single shot makes a new kind of quiet. He paid for a bed one night and borrowed the next. He sat alone in a tavern corner and shaved wood into useless shapes until his hands remembered warmth and the ache left his knuckles. He did not carry news to any family of any man. He did not ask after them either. He slept, ate, watched, and did not explain himself. When his strength stacked back up, he left before first light. He took a straight line out of town and made it hard to follow. Coyotes found a cooking pit a day's travel beyond, and bones that showed marks a knife makes when it is doing honest work in a dishonest cause. His name went ahead of him in the way of frontier rumor, cabin to trail to bunkhouse to saloon, gaining detail and losing doubt. The pattern seemed designed: a small company, the onset of winter, a stranger who wasn't there at the start but was there for the finish. Then, as soon as the weather breaks, the stranger walks in alone and asks for hot food. You cannot arrest a pattern, and in those distances no law keeps its shape through a storm. Helm knew that. He lived in the space between jurisdictions, a quick step ahead of questions and paperwork. A man who moves is a man who isn't where the witness points. Other trails told the same thin tale with different ground underfoot. In tight places, he made himself the solution. He did not wait for starvation to grant permission. He cut early, salted what he could in cloth, boiled bones twice, and did not waste grease. He treated human remains as rations and spoke of them afterward as rations, never as men. To him it was a matter of weight and distance, not sin. He was capable of piety on command, but not remorse. When someone asked him later, another territory, another roof, whether he had done the unthinkable, he did not waste breath denying. A man does what keeps him alive, he said, and if that meant sharpening the cost down to clean lines, he would not pretend he hadn't known what he was doing. He reached for calm as if it were a tool from a kit and used it until the listener grew uncomfortable enough to look away. He was not excitable. He did not need to be. His belief was simple. A single man can make his own law if he is willing to hold it in his hands. By the time winter let go and the passes gave back their trails, Boone Helm was no longer filed in people's minds as someone who had survived cannibalism. He was filed as someone who picked it when it served him, deliberate as choosing a road at a fork, consistent as a habit. Towns remembered the quiet way he ate, the steady way he looked at a room with the same patience he gave a whetstone, the way he left without turning his head. The snow would melt, the grass would rise, the rivers would swell with runoff, and men would say a stranger had come and a party had gone and the count did not match. Then they would shrug, because shrugging is another way of surviving. Helm had learned that too. Every place he left behind breathed easier and told the next place to hold its breath. He had not yet been given the name the papers would later favor. That would come after other roads, other winters, other bodies stacked in other ledgers. For now he was a rider with no cause beyond appetite, a walker who understood distance as well as any surveyor, a predator who preferred silence to decoration. He knew what weather could be made to hide. He knew how to stand in a door and let a room imagine the rest. The mountains released him and he did not thank them. He did not thank anyone. He was already measuring the next line on the map, and if the line crossed men, that was the price of a line. Between 1861 and 1863, the high country that would later be called Montana, then mostly Washington Territory, shifting into Idaho Territory. A man came in alone. He was tall and hollow-cheeked, moved like someone who'd learned to read distance the hard way, and rode a horse with ribs you could count. His rifle was the only thing about him that looked tended. He watered the animal, tied off at the willows, and sat down at the big fire without asking if the space was taken. When a name was asked for, he gave it flat: Boone Helm. No town offered, no papers shown. The pack he set down held dried meat, 3 knives, 2 flints, a roll of cord, and not a single letter written by any hand. The camp itself had no proper name, just a scatter of canvas, brush shelters, and rough cabins along a creek whose reputation changed with the season. It lay somewhere between lines that moved every year and laws that didn't reach this far even when they tried. Fugitives drifted through, and so did men who deserted one duty or another. Prospectors who wanted gold more than sleep. Hard cases who had outstayed their welcome in Walla Walla, Florence, and the Orofino diggings. There was no badge within a day's ride that meant anything. Men governed one another by proximity and threat. Arguments ended the moment a fist or a muzzle made them end. Trust was a short-lived animal. Names were traded, not given. Helm didn't hunt trouble. He didn't need to. Trouble found camps like this without an invitation. He spoke little, drank what he could count on one hand, and went out with the others when meat was needed. On one hunt, he dropped 2 elk with clean shoulder shots, then worked both carcasses with a butcher's steadiness, skinning close, drawing the organs aside in their own bag and saving what most men left to the coyotes. He boiled bones twice and scraped the grease with a stick while the others talked. A trapper watched him and said nothing, which is a kind of acknowledgement out here. The first man to go missing wasn't missed at first. He'd set out along the river to check his iron and didn't come back with the light. The following day, a lean-to up the bank held a bedroll gone over, some gear he'd sworn he wouldn't part with, and a pair of boots that looked like his. Helm said he'd found them and didn't see the owner. There were no witnesses. There was no body. Snow can be a cleaner of sins than confession. The camp counted heads and returned to whatever work kept fingers warm. A second man made a complaint, the kind that starts small because the speaker doesn't want the answer to be big. He said his belt knife had walked. Helm wore a belt knife with the same bone scales at his waist that night by the fire. When the speaker pushed, Helm didn't explain himself. He just looked, the way a man looks across a counter at a stranger who thinks to haggle over a price that won't move. The speaker went into the brush after dark and didn't step back into the circle. By morning, Helm had a small tin pot on the coals. The wind made it hard to tell what simmered there. Meat began to change hands. Helm traded cuts for caps or for a new file. Goat, he said when asked, or antelope, if the questioner wanted a name with a cleaner sound. The taste had its own ideas, salt and smoke with something most tongues couldn't place. Bones were never left where dogs could drag them. Helm burned what he didn't carry, sifted ash with a stick and scattered what remained as if trash offended him. As nights lengthened and arguments shortened, he moved his shelter out from the main cluster and tucked it into the tree line. Said the noise kept him from sleep. His fire burned small and steady. His tools were stacked like a promise. Men who walked past mentioned a smell of grease and smoke that seemed to cling no matter the wind. Helm didn't forbid visitors. He made them unnecessary. He answered what was asked and left questions to die of neglect. He partnered up once or twice the way men do when a longer trail is proposed. No handshakes, just a shared map and a shared direction. One partner told a friend he doubted Helm's miles but couldn't argue with results. The two went out before daylight and Helm returned alone 5 days later with a second pistol and a new hat band cut down to size. He said a cat had taken the man. No tracks were found. By then no one looked hard. Word moves quicker than a man with a loaded pack. The camp learned to read its own silence. A body turned up by the supply tent with a slit throat and the boots gone. The day after, Helm wore boots new enough to squeak. He didn't speak to their history and no one forced a conversation he might decide to finish with steel. By December, he was a fixture without trying to be. He never told men what to do, but when he watched two talkers who were winding themselves hot, they cooled with a visible effort. He could let an insult go by like a stray dog, rise from a card table without a word and be gone long before the man who gave offense decided his courage outweighed his sense. In the morning, the mouthy fellow's blankets lay flat. A coat that looked certain familiar rode Helm's saddle cantle, neatly folded and stitched down. Helm said nothing about the weather being colder and no one said the word stolen out loud. As rations thinned and the game moved higher into timber, the camp learned who counted their flour and who ate hope instead. Helm's portion stayed the same, a measured pot, careful cuts, the unlovely parts saved for later. He didn't trade for beans or flour. He sold meat and took tools, then sharpened those tools half the night. If a man wandered close, he'd see knives honed until they caught light like mirrors, the blade moving slow and exact across the stone while Helm's face held the stillness of a judge. 4 men asked him to join a trip east where someone swore there were tracks worth following. They left before dawn. Helm rode back alone after the 5th day with weight on his horse and flat explanations for those who met him at the ford, Men tire, men make mistakes, men die doing less. He carried 3 pouches of dried meat he hadn't had before and 2 knives no one had seen on his belt. He strung no story beyond that. The camp took the answer because answers were expensive this winter. Men heard him talk to himself now and then, the way a tired mind sometimes lets words out in a voice not meant for company. He spoke a list of names more than once, then laughed in a way that didn't invite anyone to laugh with him. One listener swore he heard, "easier when they sleep." That same night, a prospector who'd kept to himself vanished cleanly. His bedroll lay untouched. Helm had no reason on offer and none was required. The camp had learned what curiosity costs. A traveler from another diggings came through during a hard spell and slept one night under the big shelter. At daybreak, he was gone without his gear. The kind of departure a man makes only when he has no more use for any of it. A pair of hunters cut his trail and followed until brush made a puzzle of the ground. They found nothing that would make a jury, but found enough to keep their mouths closed. When someone mentioned the missing man to Helm, he said the fellow had an appetite for questions and that appetites get people killed. For all of it, he was not the kind of shadow that refuses daylight. He worked when labor was asked, hauled a beam, packed snow for a roof, fetched water when the buckets were down to wire handles and hope. He handed a man a spare flint without waiting to be thanked. He lined a new shelter so tight it cut wind to a whisper. He could be neighborly by any practical definition. He just wasn't neighborly for free. A story without a writer grows legs. "Don't wander with Boone," men said at the edge of the fire, not loud and not soft. In the new placer camps south and west, Boone justice became a shrug a man gave when talk ran out and someone failed to appear at breakfast. Those aren't laws, but they work like laws if you let them. The camp let them. He took one long trip with a quiet man who'd shared coffee with him 3 mornings running. The 2 of them walked out toward the forks where a muddy trickle had been reported as gold-bearing and returned a week later as one. Helm had a small buckskin poke that clinked with fine gold when he set it down to roll a smoke. The belt he wore had initials not his cut into the leather. "Bad footing," he said, and gave a half-smile that meant nothing. Men pretend to believe things when believing is cheaper than correcting. Some of the rougher hands began to move on. They said the ground had soured. They meant the air felt wrong when you turned your back. Helm stayed. He built a proper shelter out of pine boards with bear hide tacked, inside and lengths of rope hanging in neat loops. A man who looked in later said it put him in mind of a butcher's workroom, which is a kind of compliment if you admire clean habits. He lingered through the snow and into the breakup. Traders came through with talk of Alder Gulch showing color and Bannock still holding a crowd in spite of the new strikes. Helm traded smoked meat for files and shot. One trader later told anyone willing to sit still that a tooth turned up in a batch and he spat it into the snow before deciding silence was healthier. Another swore he'd only seen well-cut meat and didn't want to hear about teeth at all. Accounts have a way of fitting the teller's sleep. Come mid-year, he rode out in the gray before sunrise, the same way he'd come in, without asking leave, without giving warning. 2 horses, a rifle that wasn't the one he'd first arrived with, 4 knives hung in order, and a saddlebag that looked as if it would keep a man fed a long while on ground other men didn't cross. He did not look back. The camp watched him go because that's what you do when a storm line lifts and you're not certain it won't circle back. After he left, men pried up the planks of his shelter and sorted through what a winter leaves behind. Folded strips of cloth marked with initials that matched no present man, a cache of smoked meat cut to travel, bones split neatly and boiled white. The creek took what the fire hadn't. Snowmelt did the rest. Out here, evidence is only as good as the next thaw. This stretch marked a turn in his weather. Before this place, he killed when flight demanded it, or hunger drew a narrow circle around his choices. Here, among men who already wore danger like a spare coat, he learned he could set the pace himself. He picked the slow ones and the mouthy ones and the men who liked to tally other men's gear. He kept a sequence that served him. Measure the weakness, say yes to the plan, walk a man beyond hearing, end the problem, carry what's worth carrying. The rest he burned, or buried shallow, or fed to water. He didn't eat every dead man. Some he left to the creek and some under rock. He ate when it suited him and for reasons he didn't share. He justified nothing. He apologized to no one. When a question finally found him years later under a different roof, what of those camps in the northern country, he answered with a flat truth that sounded like a final lesson. They were dangerous men, and he was better at it. By the time new strikes called the camp elsewhere and the territorial lines shifted again, his name had stopped being only a name. It was a caution and a decision, and the beginning of a story you didn't want to star in. He left no mark you could trust and kept no token that would betray him. He moved like a man improving a craft, sharper, quicker, cleaner, colder. He was past surviving. He was refining. 1863 to 1864. The northern interior, where Washington Territory gave way to the brand new Idaho line, and the maps changed faster than the weather. Boone Helm was no longer just a fugitive. By the time he drifted through this country, he had turned into something harder to classify. Unwanted but unpursued, untrusted but unchallenged. He slid through settlements the way smoke leaks from tents. There for a moment, bittering the air, gone before men realized someone else had stopped breathing. Folks remembered him only when they took stock and found a space where a man used to be. That autumn he showed himself on the Salmon River edge near worn-out diggings that still held enough promise to keep a few stubborn men panning. He wore a long coat stitched from other coats and a pair of boots that did not begin the year on his feet. He asked no quarter and offered none. He bought beans, a bottle of rye, a new flint. He paid in dust, an odd coin, and buttons sawn off somebody's jacket. The storeman clocked the eyes, not wild, not drunk, always hunting, not for gold, but for advantage. Helm came back twice more, once for a knife, once for rope. Winter drove him into low timber west of the river. Trappers who passed that way said his fire always burned low, never left alone, set just off the trace so casual company would miss it. He traded hooks and spare gloves and brass he'd tapped into workable shapes, but nothing that could be called personal. When a man asked him why he slept outside towns, Helm said buildings made people sick and the ground told fewer lies. By the first days of the new year, rumor outpaced footprints. A trapper failed to come back from the bend above the ferry trail. Another traveler was found under furs with his pockets turned and his chest cut open. The meat of both thighs was missing. Helm ate something dark and cooked in a nearby outpost that evening and told the stable hand it was venison. Asked if he had hunted it, he nodded once and walked away. He slid through Lewiston while the town still hummed with river business and early government fussing, stayed long enough to swap a flask, a strip of salted meat, and a gold earring for a coat that fit better, then left before sunup. The old coat's lining showed dried blood where it rubbed a man's ribs. That same night, a prospector disappeared from a lean-to behind the tavern with his gear still inside. Helm stepped north on foot with a pack that rode heavier than it had when he came. In the spring thaw, he was seen in the Walla Walla country near cordwood cuttings for the garrison and the freighters. He asked for flint and matches. When the woodcutters offered a meal, he declined but sat to watch the meat. He did not blink much. He did not speak again. After an hour, he stood stretched and went back into the trees. One young hand said the stranger had looked at him like a starved thing studies sleeping meat. No, One laughed. Helm made no permanent camp. He kept to abandoned cabins, lean-tos left by men already gone, old fire rings lined with stones blackened by a dozen unconnected lives. He scavenged and he killed. Rabbits and squirrels for practice, some said. Nothing smaller than a man, said others. The dates stitched up too neatly. His arrival, a disappearance, the slow news of a body, the sight of him a day later at a new fire stirring a pot. Farther west in the Spokane River country, he slept a night at a trapping station used by men who ran lines for the forts and the boundary crews. He sharpened a knife until long past midnight. He told one hand that wolves had followed him for 2 nights, and he had fed them something that stopped their singing. In the morning, he traded strips of meat for powder. The man who cooked the trade tossed it in the flames halfway through the first bite and would not say why. Helm wore other men in pieces, denim sewn to blanket wool, fur cut to odd lengths, a scarf with a pattern someone recognized and then pretended not to. When asked where he got it, Helm did not answer. He watched until the man who asked looked down. He made a habit of gathering supplies like a besieged soldier without a fort: twine, flints, needles, scrap metal, shot. He slept in short slices and kept his boots on. By summer he had become a story that walked, not just a killer, an eater. Men used his name to warn boys off the temptation of dark paths. Trappers said you could smell him coming. Grease, powder, unwashed hide, and then you couldn't smell him at all, and that was worse. In the Orofino district near Pierce City, he stayed 2 days in a grain shed and left it tidier than he found it, except for the bones a man found later under the floorboards. The man told no one. Along the Palouse, a merchant swore Helm traded him 2 finger bones for a coat button. Maybe it was a joke, maybe it wasn't. The bones stayed in a drawer. The story grew legs. By now he had stopped disguising theft as accident. He wore rings with initials that did not match his name. He traveled with guns men had seen on other hips. He walked into daylight towns, bought bread, and ate it, staring at nothing in particular. He smiled at women in a way that did not reach the eyes and whistled a bar or two of something tuneless when he passed farms with smoke straight up from the chimneys. On the Touché side, a river watcher saw him bathing, pale scars like claw marks across the ribs. The watcher spoke his name by mistake. Helm stood with the knife in his fist and did not say a word until the man backed away. That man drew water somewhere else after that. Late that fall, a saddle dispute on the Snake went hot. 2 wounded, 1 dead. Helm walked off with the saddle and never bothered to glance behind. A witness said it was the first time he saw the man move quick, not out of fear, out of decision. He crossed trails with other hard cases but did not keep company. A rider who called himself Pike tried to stick with him a few days. Helm left him by a cold fire in the night, the way a man leaves off wearing a bad boot. Pike told people later that Helm spoke to himself like an accountant, names, items, numbers. And when asked who they were, Helm said, "People I won't need to eat." Behind him, he left no trail you could follow with confidence. Only quiet. Food missing, tools gone, men undone. No charges were filed because there was no one steady enough to file them. No one hunted him because hunting takes time, and time is the first thing the frontier steals. By the close of '64, he was seen less and carried heavier. His name did more traveling than he did. It turned into a shape you could feel before you saw it. Tall, spare, mannerless. The claims against him stretched from probable to fantastic, as stories do when folks measure fear in inches. Some said he could not be killed. Some said he had eaten 30 men. Some said he had made a coat of human hide. He neither counted nor denied. Numbers meant weight. Weight meant distance. Distance meant days alive. He traveled by that arithmetic and let other men keep the ledgers. He was not a bandit by code or a scout by contract. He was not a soldier, not a hunter, not anything you could pin to a payroll or a muster list. He arrived, took what he required, and moved. He had a habit of sleeping where graveyards could be seen and churches could not. He seldom stayed 2 nights unless someone died nearby, and then he stayed exactly as long as the fire needed. Men began to forget what his voice sounded like and remember only the shapes left behind when he went. Empty bed, missing blanket, a dent in the ground where a cookpot sat too long. He left no letters and gathered no keepsakes you could trace. He had peeled away everything that didn't serve: loyalty, apology, plan. Appetite and instinct and motion remained. As the snows came on and the eastern roads filled with gold dust bound for the new gulches, he let the current draw him that way, toward the high camps where law was a rumor and the timber was full of men who thought themselves worse than luck. He fit among them like a blade in its own shadow. He had become entirely and finally a man of nothing, the first days of 1864. Idaho Territory, the Bannock Road, Alder Gulch, and the interior frontier. By the turn of that season, Boone Helm was no longer unknown. His name lived in backroom conversations, trader warnings, and for the first time in that country on notices men passed hand to hand. In places where lawmen worked without pay and sheriffs were feared more than they were obeyed, the name Boone Helm became shorthand for something beyond violence. He was spoken of as a roaming executioner, a man who appeared without origin, eliminated without hesitation, and left no consistent trail except for what he meant others to find. Dead men, stripped gear, or bones beside cold fires were sometimes the only evidence. The earliest warning did not arrive as a printed broadside, but as a lantern-red circular in the gulch, late December into early January, carried from bunkhouse to assay shed and pinned to rough plank with a knife tip. It spoke of a tall man riding under various names linked to the disappearance of trappers and prospectors between Bannock and the new camps. No formal charges, only an advisory in a hard hand that the individual was not to be trusted, approached, or aided. The description matched him exactly. Lean build, long coat, carried knives, traded in boots that did not start the month on his feet. Helm had reached a different level of fear among settlers. He was no longer merely a killer or thief. He was a man whose presence canceled discussion. Camps emptied early if he appeared. Goods were left behind. Stories outran facts. His habits became recognizable. He stayed no longer than needed, traveled alone unless it profited him not to, and ate flesh when available food thinned to nothing. The shift from isolated predator to regional menace was not marked by a single act. It was the accumulation of smaller ones, more deaths, more missing, and the growing recognition that he was not random. He was directional. Earlier in that year, before the gulch boiled, he had drifted along Salmon and over into the Idaho lines, then back toward the Montana diggings as news and weather allowed. By autumn he aligned, only when it suited him, with a loose circle near the Bannock trailheads, men later tied by talk and memory to the road agents that shadowed the freight. There were no articles of agreement, no roster. Helm did not follow orders and did not give them. He joined when he wished, left when it pleased him, and returned without explanation. His only consistency was unpredictability. He helped in robberies when the odds were good. He refused a share unless he had killed someone during the work. If he had not, he demanded double, claiming his name carried risk by association. Witnesses from this stretch described him as quiet in daylight and unsettled in the hours when most men slept. He dozed in short runs. When he did sleep, he set small traps in his head and around his bedroll and pissed a circle for his own reasons. A fellow traveler once asked what he feared. Helm said he feared nothing living, then added that dying hungry was the only concern worth keeping. At a cold camp off Rattlesnake Creek, men said he killed an outlaw over coffee. The quarrel was about fuel, the pettiest kind of frontier dispute. Helm waited until the others slept, cut the man's throat, and dragged the body 200 yards into brush. In the morning, no one raised his voice. One of them noted the corpse had been partly dressed, strips of muscle missing from the back. Helm made no account of it. He kept his knife clean. As his notoriety spread, so did the ground he crossed. Before winter clamped down, he had been seen in the Idaho corridors where freighters talked Boise Basin and where rumor always arrived before the wagons. After the first hard storms, he kept closer to the lines between Bannock, Nevada City, and Virginia City. Places new enough to smell of fresh saw and old sweat. Places where authority had not learned its own gait. In each place, disappearances followed his presence. No clerk filed a formal charge. A merchant who spoke out retracted before the week was over and moved east before spring. Despite fear that showed in the way men watched their partners, there was still no warrant in a hand that could be enforced. No marshal had seen him do a thing and lived to swear to it in a room with walls. The frontier was not built for pursuit. Travel required time and provisions and trust in a landscape that made a mockery of both. Helm needed neither. He traveled without witnesses, killed the men who slowed him, and scavenged what he needed from what remained. His wider shadow put him close to those who were done waiting for courts. In the Gulch, men had started something that called itself a committee and looked like resolve in lantern light. Helm was not at first their focus. His acts lacked structure. He hunted alone or with circles that fell apart before the embers cooled. But by midwinter he was noted as a liability, not because he threatened coin or property, because he destabilized fear. Multiple informants placed him near camps and shacks where men had gone missing without a sound. He cycled answers when asked his name, Hank, Sam, J.R., and left confusion behind him. The physical description never changed. He was added to a private list kept close by men who understood that some names had to be read and burned. The list was not printed. It traveled by pocket and memory and watchword. Helm answered closer attention by making himself plainer. He walked through daylight. He drank in rooms where men could see him and measure their own nerves by the sight. In Deer Lodge, he sat at a card table and told a miner he had eaten 5 men one winter. The man laughed. Helm did not. When the miner failed to appear the next day, no one laughed at all. By the time the cold held every creek in its fist, his presence drew organized eyes. A party of 5 tried to track him west from Sign near the Bitterroot foothills. They found a fire ring, scraps of clothing and bones stripped the way a careful hand strips a carcass that has to travel light. There was no name on the fabric, only a stitched sleeve with a single letter. Boone was gone. The party returned and did not gather again. Newspapers had not yet fixed his face in type, but broadsheets out of other rooms reached for language and found animal words. Human wolf, frontier butcher, cannibal rider. None of them could say whether the meat had been taken from necessity or choice. Helm had not clarified, ever. His answers, when forced, were plain. He admitted to eating men. He did not confess to killing them for the purpose. Meat is meat when the fire is hot, he said to one who asked, and left it there. His effect on settlements grew more disruptive. He did not honor curfews laid by men without the backing to enforce them. He demanded trade on his terms and refused a hand that reached for his weapons. When a tavern man asked for the gun at his hip, Helm emptied it into a pine post, set the revolver on the counter, and said, "Now it's safe." He left before dawn. That same week, 2 men walked with ore samples toward the assay shed and did not arrive. Helm had been seen on their line. He was gone before searches were organized. He started leaving messages, not letters, scratchings. Bark carved with a knife tip, charred plank. Two instances are remembered. One read, "Boone was here and so was the last one." Another read, "You are too late again." No bodies lay beside either. Afterward, that stretch of trail was not used when there was any other way around. By then it was clear to anyone following the pattern that Helm had learned his own myth and was willing to spend it. He used fear like coin. He knew presence was enough to empty a camp and that a name could keep a posse from forming at all. When challenged, he overdid it. When ignored, he made himself undeniable. His route was not aimless. It traced settlement and freight and trouble. Where a camp grew, opportunities multiplied. He lingered in new outfits just long enough to be remembered, not long enough to be trailed. He consumed faster than the country could respond. He lived in the gap between jurisdiction and memory. As the second week of January wore thin, his name appeared on notices that mattered. The kind passed across a table and folded twice before a man put his coat back on. Not a formal wanted, not a charge a judge could read aloud, but a priority among road agents, killers, and thieves. Helm's status was singular. He had no gang, no hideout, no ledger of shares. He operated alone, killed without needing a reason and ate without shame. The last incident before everything changed involved a winter camp near the lower crossings, on the road that fed Virginia City from the west. 6 men had quartered there. Helm was seen talking with them 3 days before a storm came on hard. When the sky cleared, 3 were dead, 2 were gone, and 1 refused all questions. Helm had vanished. A skillet sat near the ashes, still warm when found. Bones lay among the coals. When the day finally came, the day that belongs to a different chapter, the town was ready. The name had done its work. Rooms that could barely agree on noon had agreed on Boone Helm. He did not hide. He did not beg. He walked as he always walked and looked at the men who had decided something about him. What happened next is for later pages. What matters here is the season of narrowing circles that carried him to the edge of it. By the time the year turned, Boone Helm was not just a threat. He was a phenomenon. No lawman had marched him into a courtroom. No cell had held him. No public record had kept pace. The question was no longer whether he could be stopped. It was who would dare try. Idaho Territory and the gulch that would be named Montana a little later. Boone Helm moved like a man who knew the hourglass was almost empty. In the final months of his freedom, he covered more ground, slept less, and made fewer excuses. The path he cut went ragged across river bottoms and timbered benches, but the ending was the same in each place. A head count came up shy, and the ones left standing learned not to ask out loud. By the last weeks of autumn, he'd slipped out of the Oregon side and into the Salmon River country, riding a mule that had more bones than fat, threading frozen cuts and wind-hollowed drifts. Clothes in layers, every layer stolen honest by his measure. 3 coats, each with another man's sweat in the seams. Boots that didn't match and didn't care. The wind hauled its weight through those valleys and he kept to his pace like there was a metronome in his skull. The first body of that stretch didn't have a name anyone kept. A trapper came down to trade pelts near a wayside and never came up for the next day's coffee. His horse wandered into a camp without him. A search party found a fire kicked to dead ash, a pack torn open, meat gone, and a quilt of blood frozen hard against the roots of a cottonwood. The rifle was missing. A day later, a tall rider showed at the Blackfoot crossing with a rifle stamped the way trappers stamped their tools. Nobody asked him to explain the initials. He kept his errands stripped to the studs. A knife, a coil of rope, a small bag of flour. He paid in coin that smelled of old grease and flake tied in a shirt scrap. The storeman who took the trade noted the quiet, the steady hands, and the smell of burned fat that clung to the man like a second skin. That night the store stayed dark longer than it should have. In the morning, the door hung open and the shelves were orderly. The store man was not. Freight cut north and east ahead of real winter. Helm drifted parallel, a night's march off the road or a day behind, slipping close whenever a team broke early. He would ask for food without shame, take a place at the edge of a fire like a man setting his boot on a rung, and watch until he knew what was tied where. Sometimes a skillet, sometimes a spare blanket, sometimes a man, each missing bought someone else a new habit of looking over his shoulder. One driver was found in the snow with his throat cut, coat peeled, and his tracks swallowed by a dusting that arrived like an alibi. A belt knife lay dulling in the frost. Later that week, boots that fit the dead man too well turned up walking a rider past the old Lemhi mission site, heels scabbed with blood gone dark. Someone remembered the stare more than the face. For a few weeks, Helm paired up and broke off with the kind of men who don't ask the last name first. Sometimes he rode beside Jack Gallagher, who carried charm the way other men carry sidearms. They crossed the Beaverhead and leaned hard into a string of cabins with roofs that leaked and doors that didn't lock. Helm's rule was simple. Witnesses were a cost to be paid then and there. Gallagher liked to leave a man scared enough to warn others. They argued with their mouths once and with their choices afterward. When a rancher got to keep his breath at dusk and lost it by morning, Gallagher swore and rode away alone. Helm did not explain the difference between dusk and morning. By December, there wasn't much point pretending. He used his own name when it served him and other names when it didn't. Once he asked a tavern girl if she wanted to see the last one he'd eaten. She pushed a laugh across the bar like a coin she hoped he wouldn't keep. When the shutters closed, she wasn't at her bed. Men learned to separate themselves from questions they could not lift. A snow-slammed camp took him in for mercy's sake. 4 trappers, 1 stove that didn't draw right, heaps of breath in the cold air making ghosts of them all. Helm sat with his back to the logs and his face to the door. One man stepped out into the weather and never returned. No one said Helm's name as a sentence. No one had to. On the 5th morning, Helm was gone. So were 2 rifles, 1 coat, and the good meat. A track led into trees and came back pale with a single sentence. He took everything. By then, the talk in the gulch had hardened into action. There were committees by lantern light and lists that didn't want printers yet. Names learned by heart and burned, watchwords passed from mouth to mouth. The line between Bannock and the new diggings was stiff with freight and fear. Helm wasn't the first name on anyone's roster. He was the name that changed how a room sounded. He didn't take coin so much as he taxed nerve. That was enough to move men who were tired of finding friends short by one. He answered attention by getting easier to see. Daylight on Wallace Street. Whiskey bought slow. A chair taken in a corner where a man could watch a door and a window with one turn of his head. The trails grew a mile longer as men learned detours they hadn't known they needed. He traveled the edges the way a wolf works a fence line, running the Ruby, the Madison, the Gallatin country, then back again by ridges that let a man see who followed. When he needed food, he did not lose time naming the animal. When he needed gear, he took it and left the buckle straps cut and neat. When he wanted quiet, he made it and moved on before it got cold. The cold kept its own calendar. In the gulch, a jury under open sky had danced Ives by the neck in December and put backbone into men who'd been speaking their courage softly. By the 2nd week of the new year, the handwriting in the back rooms had given way to lists read out loud. The watch was for road agents, freight cutters and stage stoppers, and the men who salted fear in other men's bread. Helm's name slid onto the short page, not for an affidavit, but for a decision. They didn't wait on warrants from towns that weren't towns yet. They let the season be the clerk. He tried to outrun the shape closing in. Shallow rivers took his tracks. Frozen lakes held his weight where the ice was honest. He slept in adits and under overhangs, never twice in one hole unless he had to. When he wanted to lose a man, he climbed. When he wanted to lose dogs, he waited. He threaded past cabins where families had learned to listen with the lamp out. Hands on latches, pistols on stools. The word was passed with the care men give to live coals. A tall man with the wrong boots, a long coat made of other coats, 3 knives and no reason to share them. The answer was the same every place the word traveled. Bar the door, bank the fire, and keep 2 in a bed. As the ice set harder, he tightened his circle. Alder Gulch, Bannock Road, Ruby Diggings, and the crossings that fed them. He tried daylight threats in one camp, asked straight for flour and shot and a blanket and pointed his need like a gun. A man said no. Helm shot him in the leg below the knee and walked off with the blanket. The man died of it later, and there were no charges because there was no clerk brave or steady enough to own the ink. It began to end the way such things end, quietly, by arrangement. A merchant who had read the private notice did not look surprised when Helm took his coin and his measure in the same minute. The merchant poured him whiskey and let him talk, then folded a message into a friendly palm that knew where to carry it. Helm left by the back and the message moved by the front. Riders listened for the whistle of a story arriving early and didn't need to. Men went on foot that night instead, a few at a time so the street couldn't count them. The beam in the half-built place on Wallace held still like it was part of the sky. Names were said in order and burned from memory as soon as they were spoken. Lyons, Gallagher, Parrish, Lane, Helm. The doors that mattered were marked by men who knew how to knock once the right way. They didn't catch him by luck. They closed the block and then the hallway and then the room. He looked at their faces and counted and stopped counting. He did not beg or bark. He put his hands where a man puts them when he intends to live a little longer by doing so. The steel came on. The knives came off his belt and out of his boots and from the place he kept one tucked where men don't always think to search. A length of rope rode in a pocket like a promise. He didn't get to touch it. They walked him into thin, cutting air and down the stairs toward rooms that had been used for other purposes yesterday and would be used for other purposes tomorrow. He said one thing, a flat line about being finished, and saved whatever else he had. The rest of it belonged to the men who had decided to stop writing his story in the present tense. They kept their hands steady. He kept his feet under him. Boone Helm never walked free again. January 13th, 1864, Virginia City, Idaho Territory. The arresting party, 2 men from the Vigilance Committee and 1 independent scout, tied his hands, searched his coat, and turned out a belt pouch with a strip of smoked meat, a stained spoon carved from human bone, and a coin purse wrapped in horsehide slick with old grease. They tugged at his boots and found a thin knife stitched into the lining. They worried at a pocket hem and pulled a second blade from thread neat as a cobbler's work. Helm watched their fingers like weather, interested, unmoved. He let the rope bite. He didn't ask names. They marched him down the ridge at gunpoint, the 3 of them walking careful through thaw-slick brush and ruts frozen into the street like ribs. No one spoke. Breath steamed and drifted off. The road opened and a wagon waited under guard like a mouth held shut. Helm stepped up without being told. They bound his ankles so the ride would stay honest. He asked for water once and was told the creek ran close if he wanted to try it with his hands tied. He asked for tobacco once, and the nearer vigilante told him to save his breath. Helm lifted his eyes past roofs rimed white and studied the black seam of sky as if there were a map hidden there he could still use. The holding place was a granary-turned cell, braced with new pine and iron rings sunk into stone that smelled of wet earth. They stripped him to grease and scars, scrubbed him with lye water that raised the stink of old smoke, and cropped his hair short in case a sliver of steel sat there waiting. 2 more knives showed themselves in the wash. One slipped in a boot seam, one in a cuff stitched double. They rebound his wrists to a wall chain, buckled his ankles wide, and shoved a cot and a bucket to opposite corners like afterthoughts. No window. 1 oil lamp smoked on its hook and made the air taste like pennies. A deputy changed the lamp when it guttered and kept his mouth shut, as if voice cost more than oil. Word outran footsteps, no broadsides, no press, no ink warmed for type. Names moved by hand and mouth, by folded scraps slipped across bars, by a nod in a doorway, by a knife point pinning thin board that said just enough. The street learned to stand still. Men who had lost friends without graves drifted past and studied the door as if it might confess. Some cursed into their collars. Some hunted cracks in the timber. Most folded their hands behind their backs and stared because staring was the only part of judgment a bystander can own. Interrogation started before the lamp had been changed a 3rd time. Still the same night, because winter lays hours end to end until they look like one long line. 3 came down the stairs with a table that had seen better meals and 2 chairs that creaked. A committee captain with verdict in his face. A deputy whose jaw had learned to set and stay. A civilian clerk with a steady hand and a hat held too long in his fingers. They unshackled Helm from the wall, left irons on his legs, and sat him as though a place had been saved. They asked where he was made. He said Lincoln County, Kentucky, and let the rest rot. He would not name his parents. Family is what you lose along the way, he said, flat as a fence post. Asked if he had murdered his cousin, he said, yes. Asked why, he said, too soft for the mountains, I did what he couldn't. He didn't look for softer words. Shown a coat pulled from his bundle, he nodded and said, that was Fred. He didn't need it anymore. The captain looked at the clerk, and the clerk wrote without looking up. They read names the way a bell lists its dead. Helm denied none. When asked if he had eaten human flesh out of preference, he said, it kept me standing. Pressed to say how, he gave it plain, the way a butcher gives advice and doesn't dress it in anything. How thigh meat cooks through without turning to leather if you cut cross-grain. How organs keep packed tight in snow. How you warm a joint and break it clean for marrow. How the lower back holds meat worth the carry. The clerk kept his pen on the page until his hand shook, leaned hard against the door, stepped outside, and vomited. He came back pale and wrote faster, sleeve wet where he'd wiped his mouth. When Helm spoke of trimming the back and saving the kidney fat because it rendered best, the clerk swallowed once, staggered out again, and vomited a 2nd time under the stairs. He returned with jaw set and the pen scratching like he meant to get to the end of the night by ink alone. By the 4th round, Helm's answers shortened into nods and small cuts of the hand. Did he fear the rope? He shook his head. Damnation? Depends who's in charge. He didn't smile when he said it. He didn't look up to see if anyone else did. Above them, the town had gone loud in the quiet way. Lanterns burned in rooms meant for sleep and did other work instead. Lists were read in low voices and fed to stoves. A hammer tested timber up Wallace Street, tap, measure, tap. And the sound ran down boards and sat in men's ears like a clock with no numbers. The night had already decided what morning wanted. They brought Helm upstairs once late into a room that smelled of fresh saw and wet wool. Not a court, no robes, no clerk built for echo, no law polished for listeners. 12 chairs by vote because a room needs a number to look at. Ranchers with rope hands, miners dusted to the cuffs, tradesmen with tools in their pockets, and one retired officer who kept his hat brim in his lap like a lid on something hot. No defense was offered. None was requested. Witnesses came one at a time. A freight driver swore Helm had worn a dead man's coat and boots down the road like they fit him fine. A saloon keeper said Helm had bragged about eating his cousin and did not laugh when the room tried him with it. A woman from Ruby Valley said her brother had given a stranger shelter on a storm night and never saw the morning. She spoke like a person who had run out of softer words weeks ago. Two men from Bannock told how Helm had admitted, plain as weather, to killing a camp companion and cooking the man's liver over a pan, while the others looked at the ground and counted the sounds the fat made. They set what they had on the table. The spoon carved out of bone, smoothed by a mouth that didn't care where it had fed. A strip of cured flesh from Helm's pack, dark and hard as a lie told too long. A rifle with initials that didn't match his name. A torn page from a pocket Bible with names scratched into the blank where prayers aren't owed. Asked if he recognized any of it, Helm nodded once at the spoon. That one worked, he said. Not pride, inventory. The room held. No outbursts, no speeches. The sheriff's man stood behind Helm's chair with a rifle that didn't lower. The air turned heavier and stayed. When the captain asked if Helm had anything worth hearing before the men stepped aside, Helm said, "I've done what I've done. Let the rest catch up." The clerk wrote it the way a man writes down a thing he knows other men will misremember by dawn. They did not leave the building. They did not put their heads under a different roof to get brave. Decisions had been ripening since December. Guilty on what mattered. Rope for the rest. The captain read the manner and let the hour wait where daylight could find it. Helm stood without being told, like a man meeting weather head-on. "Make it quick," he said, and didn't look to see where the line of mercy stopped. They took him back below for what the night had left. Footsteps settled and stilled overhead. A mallet tested a beam and liked the answer it got. A deputy slid a blanket through and left it without a word. Helm draped it across his shoulders, paced in short loops until the chain told him to stop, turned, and walked the same loops again. He drank water when it was past. He did not ask for tobacco again. The lamp smoked. The air tasted like the inside of a coin. Closer to dawn, a deputy asked if he wanted a preacher. "He can talk," Helm said, "but it won't change what I did." He said it without heat, like a man naming his own tools. He kept his eyes on the crack of gray at the bottom of the door as if light were something he could resist by looking harder. The town gathered itself without being told how. Men stood with hats jammed low or held to their chests. Others stood with empty hands and full faces. The beam waited where carpenters had left it, solid as a sentence. The rope lay coiled like a decision ready to be thrown. Somewhere a horse stamped at the cold. Somewhere a woman closed a shutter and didn't open it again. They told him it would be daylight. He nodded once and kept pacing to where the last of the dark out. He said, "I'll talk when the rope's on. January 14th, 1864. Virginia City, Idaho Territory." Morning came clear and hard. Frost sat on roofs, wagon seats, and rails. No wind moved the street. Men spoke low or kept their mouths shut. The place chosen for the hanging was the unfinished building on Wallace Street. It had walls raised and a heavy center beam meant to carry roof weight. The beam would carry rope. There was no scaffold in a yard. There was no trap door. Boxes and planks had been set so a man could be stood, given a loop, and dropped without any more hardware than hands and timing. Helm was awake before the lock turned. He had paced the short reach of chain through the dark. 4 steps, stop, 4 back, until the work lost meaning. When the hinges answered, he was already sitting on the cot edge, eyes on the strip of light under the door. 2 guards came in with a coat and rawhide. One told him to stand. He stood without help. Thin, steady, eyes dry. He put on the coat, cinched the belt, and said nothing. He refused prayer. He would take water if handed. He did not ask twice. When asked if he had anything to say to the men who had put this together, he said, "It's already done." They brought him out into the cold and put him in line with the other four: George Clubfoot Lane, Jack Gallagher, Frank Parrish, and Hayes Lyons. Rifles on both flanks. No one in the line spoke. Boots hit board, then dirt, then board again. The turn into the new building was sharp and plain. Inside, the floor was rough and creaked. The heavy beam crossed above. Ropes hung over it with running slack coiled in a fist. Knots were set to lie high on the left side of the neck. Men at each rope checked their work and did not hold any man's eyes longer than necessary. The crowd formed without being called. They stood along Wallace and up the south slope where they could see into the opening. Hats down or held to chests, shawls drawn close. Some stood on barrels, some leaned against posts. A few children were lifted for a look, then taken down again. One woman held a Bible shut in both hands, another covered her child's mouth and kept it covered. Nobody counted out loud. There was no speech from a platform, no reading from paper. This was a town job done in a workroom. They set the five where they needed them. Each man was placed under a fall. Loops were opened and tightened. Knots were checked with 2 fingers and a tug. Lane asked to speak. He denied what he could and asked that his things be returned to his people. Gallagher spat once, swore under his breath, and let the rest go. Lyons wept and said he had been led wrong. Parrish spoke a short prayer low enough that only the nearest heard it. Helm waited until the knot sat snug against his neck and the tail of rope lay in his palm. He looked toward Gallagher and said, "Kick away, old fellow. Every man for his principles. Let her rip." He did not raise his voice. The room heard him anyway. There was no formal order called from a bench. A captain gave a nod. Men on rope took that for what it meant. Boxes and planks were set to kick. Helm did not wait. He stepped off on his own, legs straight, back straight. The rope took his weight. The break came fast. He did not kick. He did not twist. Gallagher jerked twice and went still. Lane's legs worked and then stopped. Parrish hung slack from the first second. Lyons shuddered hard and settled. The sound of the lines taking strain against the beam was the loudest thing in the room. No doctor came forward with a watch to call minutes. The men who had the job kept count the way men do. Eyes on faces, hands on rope, time measured by breath and by the end of motion. Hats came off. A child cried near the rear and was carried out. No one climbed to the boards, no one cut early. No one spoke unless the work required a word. They let the five hang long enough to leave no doubt and longer still to leave no room for talk about mistakes. When they were certain, the five were lowered to planks. Each was wrapped against the air. No relatives stepped out to claim a body, none were expected. The wagon was brought to the opening. The bundles were lifted and laid in. Lines were tied to keep them from shifting. A few short lengths of hemp were cut from rope ends and pocketed. The long coils were kept. There was no photograph taken. There was no printed notice posted that morning. Names and the place were kept by men and by memory. The wagon moved slow up to Boot Hill. The ground was iron where the sun had not reached. Picks started the cuts. Shovels followed when the pick had made a seam. No coffins, no prayers. Each body had its own hole. Dirt was pushed back and tamped by Boot. Stones were set on top to keep animals out and to hold the work down. The job was done without talk. When the last stone was settled, the men checked the ground with their heels and turned back toward town. The beam on Wallace stayed where the carpenters had set it. Later, the building would be finished and used for ordinary business. That beam would go back to its first purpose. Rope ends went the way rope ends go in a place that uses what it has. Some cut short and kept, some fed to fire, some returned to storage. Men who had stood on the rope lines found splinters and hemp dust in their pockets and did not shake them out until they were off the street. An inventory of Helm's things was made and put away. 1 coat, 1 shirt, 1 pair of trousers, 1 belt, 1 pair of boots, 1 tin cup, 1 spoon carved from bone, 1 loop of leather. The list used a small scrap of paper. The scrap was folded and stored. No church filed protest. No petition was made to move any body. The men who had handled names put their papers in their pockets and went home by separate streets. Wallace Street sounded like work again by afternoon. Sleds and wagons moved. Stoves thumped and drew. Hammers and saws took up their regular argument. The room that had been used for the hanging went back to looking like a job site. Boards were measured, lines snapped, nails set. Rope marks on the beam would fade under sawdust and smoke. The morning would not fade, but it would stop standing in the doorway. Later accounts tried to give the scene parts it did not have. They said there was a trap door and a measured fall. They said a physician called out exact times. They said a sheriff read a writ from a paper with a seal. Those things did not live here. What lived here was plain. 5 men, a beam, rope thrown over, not set high, a step, a drop, a wagon, the hill. The town did not hold a ceremony. It held to a decision and finished it. Boot Hill kept quiet through that afternoon. Stones stayed where they were set. No markers were put in. No names were cut into wood. The earth took the weight and held it. In camp and in rooms over stores, men finished the talk they had started the night before and then set the talk down. Those who had watched said what they had seen. Those who had not watched listened and learned the order. There was no confusion about the order. By evening, the frost softened at the edges. Boards dried where boots had scraped them. Men who had stood in the crowd put their hats back on and stepped into the work they had left. Men who had carried rifles wiped them down and put them away. The carpenters set their levels and got on with the build. The hill above town went back to holding its silence. The choice the town had made did not need a second telling. There were no newspapers in Virginia City to print a same-day account. There were no broadsides nailed up on that morning. The lines that would be repeated later, who stood where, who said what, the words Helm threw across to Gallagher, would travel by mouth and show up in later writing with small changes. The thing itself did not change. 5 bodies had dropped from a beam in an unfinished room on Wallace Street, and the town had stayed and watched until the work was done. The men who had arranged the mourning did not keep the room for show. They did not rope it off. They did not point at it for the rest of the day. They left it to the men who had to finish the roof and hang doors. The center beam remained where it was. The next time most people looked up at it, it would be holding boards and snow load, not rope. Nothing further was added to Helm's record that mattered. No extra notice was written. His name stayed on men's tongues as a warning and then as a story. The room on Wallace became a place to buy or fix something. The beam kept doing its job. The street kept its width. The sky kept its cold. The day was counted and put away. The account ends there. Morning cold. Ropes used, bodies carried, earth closed, work resumed. After Boone Helm was executed, the first records that preserved his actions were compiled not by journalists, but by vigilante chroniclers. Members of the Montana Vigilance Committee wrote official journals summarizing the events of their campaign, including names, dates, and accusations. These included Boone Helm. His entry was not long. It listed his execution date, association with the Henry Plummer gang, and general reputation for violence. A few lines mentioned cannibalism. No other explanation was provided. These ledgers were preserved by families of the original committee members and later deposited in regional archives. They remain some of the earliest surviving records mentioning Helm's crimes directly. The first broader public account came from Thomas Dimsdale, a teacher and editor in Virginia City who had supported the vigilantes. In 1866, he published The Vigilantes of Montana, one of the earliest printed narratives describing the frontier justice movement. In it, Dimsdale mentioned Boone Helm by name, portraying him as a remorseless killer. He described Helm as a man of coolness in murder and included a reference to his cannibalism. Dimsdale's tone was matter of fact. He did not embellish the details, nor did he dwell on them. His aim was to justify the vigilante actions, not to romanticize the criminals. The book circulated widely in the American West and became a source for later writers. Other early accounts came from memoirs written by lawmen, settlers, and surviving members of the Vigilance Committee. These were not always consistent. Some called Helm a lone wanderer. Others placed him at the center of Plummer's operations. A few referenced events that do not match verified timelines. In the absence of standardized journalism or centralized archives, details shifted. Names were misremembered. Conversations were invented. But the core story remained intact. Boone Helm had killed indiscriminately, spoken openly of eating human flesh, and had shown no fear when facing the gallows. By the 1880s, as the American frontier closed and settlement expanded, the era of the outlaw became an object of fascination. Publishers began releasing sensationalist accounts of frontier violence. Helm appeared frequently in these books. One example was A.J. Sowell's Early Settlers and Indian Fighters of Southwest Texas, which included a brief but exaggerated account of Helm's crimes. Another was noted American Outlaws and Desperados, which mixed known history with fiction, portraying Helm as a wandering cannibal who ate companions for pleasure rather than survival. These books reshaped Helm's legacy. Over time, facts gave way to spectacle. His documented murders were merged with rumors of other killings for which there was no evidence. Some versions claimed he had eaten 12 men. Others placed him in states he never entered. Stories of him shooting victims in the back, laughing while dismembering corpses, and sleeping beside half-eaten remains became common. Many of these accounts were written decades after his death, often by authors with no access to primary records. Throughout the early 20th century, historical societies and amateur historians in Montana and Oregon began trying to separate fact from legend. Many returned to the records of Dimsdale and the vigilantes. They re-examined the documented events, murders near Florence, the killing of Littleberry Chute, his association with Henry Plummer, his arrest and execution. They looked for birth and marriage records in Kentucky, land deeds in California, and surviving statements from men who had traveled with him. These efforts clarified some elements of his story. They confirmed his year of birth as 1828, his home in Lincoln County, Kentucky, and the existence of surviving brothers who remained in the region after Boone fled west. Cannibalism remained the most debated element. There is no doubt Helm admitted to it. Witnesses testified that he spoke about it freely. Some survivors of his journeys confirmed it as well. The cases in which it occurred under survival conditions, such as after being stranded in the Bitterroot Mountains, were understood in context, even if disturbing. But later accounts claimed he consumed human flesh even when other food was available. In museums and historical sites across Montana, Helm is mentioned in exhibits dealing with the frontier justice era. In Virginia City, a signpost near Boot Hill Cemetery lists the names of those hanged in 1864, including Helm. A short biography appears on some plaques and websites associated with Montana's Tourism Bureau. These entries are restrained. They refer to Helm as a notorious outlaw or member of the Plummer gang. They usually mention murder and sometimes cannibalism, but avoid sensational detail. The tone is one of detached record-keeping, not dramatization. Documentaries about American outlaws have occasionally included Boone Helm in segments focusing on vigilante justice, the lawlessness of the frontier, and the extremes of human behavior. In these, he is often contrasted with other figures such as Jesse James or Billy the Kid, men who cultivated reputations as rebels or folk heroes. Helm had no such mythology. He was not seen as clever, charming, or political. He was remembered instead as a man who took what he wanted, killed when it was convenient, and lacked any trace of empathy. He had no romantic angle, no loyal following, no narrative of misunderstood purpose. Historians who study criminal psychology sometimes refer to Helm as an early example of an antisocial killer who operated without remorse or regret. Some describe him as an opportunist shaped by the violence and chaos of his environment. Others consider him a case of inherent cruelty untethered from circumstance. Regardless of interpretation, all credible historians agree on the central facts. Boone Helm killed multiple men, admitted to eating human flesh, and faced execution without apology. His legacy today is not one of fascination but of discomfort. While many Western outlaws have been glamorized, Helm remains an exception. He is mentioned in books about cannibalism, criminal pathology, and the darkest extremes of frontier survival. His story is less often told for entertainment than for the sake of historical completeness. Teachers, researchers, and writers studying Montana's early years include him because he cannot be left out. Not because he is celebrated, but because he embodies the worst of what that era could produce. No buildings bear his name. No statues were built. His grave marker is maintained by local preservationists not to honor him but to ensure the record of what he did is not forgotten. Visitors who see his name often react with silence or revulsion. His legacy is not one that invites sympathy. It is one that demands acknowledgement, not for who he was but for what he represented. Boone Helm lived during a time of lawlessness, opportunity, and survival at all costs. He exploited it fully. He was not a product of society's failure. He was a man who embraced cruelty, moved through it comfortably, and died with the same emptiness with which he had lived. His name persists not because he mattered, but because he showed what it looked like when a person no longer recognized human life as something to be valued. His memory is the echo of that void,